Hello everyone and welcome to section 7 where we're going to be looking at network sniffing and spoofing. So let us look at what we're going to be learning in this section. Alright, so we'll start off with network discovery. So in this video we're going to be looking at how to discover devices connected to our network with a tool called Netdiscover. Alright, we'll then get started with the network sniffing process where I'll be explaining the fundamentals of sniffing, and we'll get started with a network sniffing tool called TCP dump. We'll then move on to the second part of network sniffing where we'll be using Wireshark, which I'm sure probably most of you have already heard of, which is a fantastic network sniffing and packet capturing tool or program. Alright, we'll then move on to spoofing, more specifically ARP spoofing, where we'll be looking at the ARP spoofing process and how we can do it using a tool called ARP spoof, alright, to achieve a man-in-the-middle position. We'll then finish off with looking at how to actually use the ARP poisoning attack method to get man-in-the-middle access with a tool called Ettercap. Alright, so that is what we're going to be looking at in this section. So let's get started. In this video, we're going to get started with network discovery with Netdiscover. Alright, so this is a really important stage, especially when it comes down to network sniffing and spoofing. So essentially what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be discovering the devices connected to our network. Now we looked at this very basically with Nmap, where we could find out what devices were connected to our network and we could scan for an entire range, alright, on our network. Now, as I said, we're going to be performing sniffing and spoofing attacks on our local area network. So Netdiscover is a fantastic tool that will discover the devices connected to the network that you are connected to. Alright, so let's get started. Now by default, Netdiscover is already pre-installed and pre-configured with Kali Linux, which is awesome. Okay, so it's really very simple to get launched. So just open up your terminal and you can just type in Netdiscover. Now before we get started, I'm going to use the help menu because I want to explain some of the commands that are the most popular and what they all mean. Alright, so I'm going to hit enter, and as you can see, it's going to give you this wonderful help menu. Fantastic. Now let's look at some of the commands that we're going to be using. One of the most important commands that you'll be coming across is the I command. The I command allows you to specify the network interface or the network device that you want to use to perform the scan. What do I mean? If you have a wireless adapter, for example, an adapter that allows packet injection, you can specify that. If you're using Ethernet, like what we're using and probably what you'll be using, if you're using a virtual machine, you will then specify that you want to use the Ethernet 0 interface. Or if you're using a Wi-Fi adapter, you can specify the WLAN 0 interface. Now, you might be a bit confused and you might be asking, well, how do I know what I'm using? Well, all you have to do is just open up a new terminal and type in ifconfig. Alright, so as you can see, this is our current interface, and as you can see, it's going to be labeled as Ethernet 0. That is the standard for all Ethernet connections, especially on Linux distributions. So by default, we're using an Ethernet connection. So if I go to my interface here, and as you can see, I'm using a wired connection. So by default, on any virtual machine, the default connection will be an Ethernet connection. So if you're using a wireless adapter, it will give you the interface name as WLAN 0. Okay, so you then specify it from there. Alright, so we'll be looking at that with Netdiscover. Now moving on in terms of the commands, you then have the R command that allows you to specify a range of a network. So for example, if we wanted to specify a range of only a certain amount of devices on our network or a range of IP addresses on our network, we can do that. We'll be looking at that as well. You then have your file command, which is not that important, but it allows you to scan a list of ranges that is contained into a given file. So if you had a list of ranges in a text document, you can specify that text document to be scanned using the L command. As for passive mode, this is again not very important. As you can see, this option is saying do not send anything, only sniffing. So essentially what this means is it's not going to send any type of protocol or any type of request to any device on the network to get more information about them. I'll be explaining this in a few seconds. Alright, you can then specify a file with the M command that contains a known MACs. Now in this case, if you do not familiar with what a MAC means, MAC is essentially the media access control protocol that essentially whose purpose is, if you might be asking, the media access control address is a unique identifier that essentially maps the device on the network, and it acts as an identifier of a device on a network. What do I mean? So for example, a mobile device could have a MAC address, and that MAC address uniquely identifies it on the network. Alright, so that the router or your portal or your gateway knows who it's communicating with. So let's say your phone on your network sends a request to the router for a web page. Now your phone sends a request to the router. The router receives the request from a MAC address. Alright, so now it knows that that MAC address came from what IP address, so it resolves the device on the network, and then once it receives the web page, it sends it to that MAC address, and therefore it knows that device, that MAC address belongs to that device. Okay, so it's very important to understand that. So if you had a list of known MACs, you can also use that. As for the other commands, these are something that are not really touched in most cases, especially in my case, since I've worked in a network administration job before. Some of the most common ones are the ones I've just specified. So let's get started with some basic network discovery. Alright, so main principle or aim here is to discover the devices connected to our network. Now, as I said, to get started, all you have to do is just type in Netdiscover. Alright, so Netdiscover. Now we need to specify the interface that we're using to perform the scan. In this case, we're using the I command, and then we specify the interface name, which in our case is Ethernet 0. Alright, and if I hit enter, let's just perform this basic scan. What's going to happen is going to scan our entire network for devices connected to the network with the Ethernet 0 adapter. So I'm going to hit enter, and the scanning process has begun. And just give it a few seconds, and there we are. So we have devices that are discovered. Now let's look at the information that is being displayed to us. So as you can see, it is going to be currently scanning, and it will continue scanning until you stop it or you halt the scanning process, and you can do that with the Control+C command on your computer. Alright. So as you can see, it's going to tell you here that 4 captured ARP requests packets from 4 hosts. Alright, so if you're not familiar with what ARP is the address resolution protocol. Alright, so it is essentially an internet protocol whose purpose is to map the IP addresses to the machine addresses. Alright, so essentially what's happening here is you're receiving and sending ARP requests to these devices, and they're uniquely identifying themselves, or they're identifying themselves. As I said, it's using the ARP protocol. Okay, so the information being sorted out here is given in forms of the IP address, which in this case is the local IP. Very, very important information. You then have your MAC address, which gives you the MAC address. Again, vitally important information. You have your MAC vendor and host names given right here. Okay, so essentially these are the names of the devices connected to your network. For more information, you can see that, for example, here at the IP address, which is my default gateway, the 192.168.1.1, that is my router. As you can see, it is running TP-Link. So that is vital information that, if gathered, can give you insight into how devices are arranged, or what devices are actually connected to the network and how they are configured with each other. Alright, so again, you can see that I have other devices, like for example, this is my Windows workstation right here, and this is the current Windows computer, and more specifically the Kali Linux computer that I'm currently using. Now, you might be asking, well, how do we scan for a range of addresses? Now, that is the next thing we're going to be doing. Alright, so we're just going to we're going to stop this scanning process by hitting Control+C, and we open up the Netdiscover command again. Now, to specify a range, if we just open up the help menu again, we can see that the option to specify a range is the R command. So let us do that right now. Right, so we're going to hit clear, and we're going to type in Netdiscover. We specify our interface. It is vitally important that you always specify the interface you're using, because you can choose to use a Wi-Fi adapter for your scanning, which will also discover other Wi-Fi devices connected. Alright, so and Netdiscover I, which is Ethernet 0, we have selected our interface. Now we select the range. Alright, so in this case, I'm going to scan my subnet, which is where my virtual lab is hosted. So in this case, you would find my Kali Linux virtual machine. And if I had any other virtual machine running, like for example, my Windows 7 virtual machine, we would also be able to discover it here. You'll also see that it will discover some of my mobile devices that are connected to my subnet. Alright, so my subnet is 192.168.1.1/24. That is how you specify a subnet. Now your subnet may be configured completely differently. You could have configured it with 2 or 3 or whatever you felt like. In my case, I have configured it this way. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to hit enter, and it's going to scan the subnet of the IP range that I've specified. So I'm going to hit enter, and as you can see, the scanning process has begun. So just give it a few seconds, and it's going to start gathering the devices that are connected to my subnet. Now, as you can see, I do not have my other router connected. I only have my default gateway, which is running on the subnet that I specified right here. So 192.168.1.1. Alright, so that is correctly configured under our subnet. And that is how to perform some basic network discovery with Netdiscover, it is a fantastic tool that allows you to get an understanding of what devices are currently connected to your network and what their names are, what their MAC addresses are. Alright, so in the next video, we'll be looking at network sniffing with TCP dump. Alright, so I'll be seeing you in the next video.